you guys just go ahead and go. I'm ready.
Super. So welcome back to the Dive Line. It's Jim and Craig again. We have a great guest today. It's Bret Gilliam. Bret, you started diving at the age of 8. You had your own business from the age of 10. We'll talk about that in a minute. You are what we would refer to as a real pioneer in the dive industry. So to start off from the beginning, how come you started diving at 8 years old?
Well, it was all my father. My father was a senior naval officer, and he indulged my initial interests in snorkeling. And I had actually become a pretty accomplished free diver, breath hold diver. And I was doing all that. And I was, in some cases, I was getting down, 40 feet, 50 feet sometimes free diving. And I was, collecting lobster and shooting some fish occasionally and stuff like that. And what completely changed my life was in 1959, we watched the first episodes of the television show Sea Hunt with Lloyd Bridges. And I was absolutely fascinated. It was extraordinary for me to see this firsthand. We were living in Key West, Florida at the time, back in those days. And remember, that was, oh Christ, that was 61 years ago.
You was living on a boat, Bret, wasn't you? You was living on a boat in the Keys. Why was that?
That's correct. Key West, Florida. My father had gotten tired of having to be transferred every 2 years. And then we had to move into other housing, or he'd buy another house or whatever. And he just got tired of it. And so he's a very similar guy to me. In fact, we're more like brothers than father and son. But he decided in 1959 to buy an 82-foot luxury motor yacht. And he moved the entire family on board. And
What a dad.
that's where we lived. And the very first duty assignment that we were transferred to was Key West, Florida. And against all odds, normally we would have been 2 years in a particular, assignment area for the Navy. But as it was, we got almost 3.5. And that was great at my age, because it started off my diving and doing all this stuff. I got my YMCA certification card in 1959 at age 8. And the entire class, I would say, lasted about an hour and a half, and it consisted of, learning to clear your mask, and you had to do a ditch and don exercise where you took your equipment off and you put it back on, and they talked to you about, don't hold your breath and blah blah blah. My whole entire training was about an hour and 15 minutes, and when I was finished, the instructor, who was working on a charter boat there in Key West, told me that there was something else that he wanted me to do. And I said, what was that? And I presumed it was some other type of exercise. And he handed me down some bottom scrapers and had me scrape the bottom of his boat. and that's how I started out. And then I began, because of the inspiration of Sea Hunt, that's what led my father to the decision to let me go ahead and take diving lessons, which I did. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and have been doing it ever since 1959 now, which is hard to believe, but that's, it's 62 years now.
And so your first diving, or your first business when you were 10 years old, was that diving related, was it?
Actually, it was. When I first started, my very first business that I started was a fish trapping business, live fish. And I wasn't trapping the fish to kill them or eat them or anything. I was selling them to the Key West Aquarium, which was a big exhibit there. And I also started selling my fish to other places in the Florida Keys, including Key Largo. And ultimately, I ended up going all the way up to Miami, to their Seaquarium, it was called, and selling fish to them. Now you have to understand this. That was 150 miles from Key West, Florida, which was a long, long way. I was, let's see, 11 years old. And of course, I didn't have a driver's license. I was doing the fish collecting by going out in the family's Boston whaler, and I had these traps that I put in the water that didn't have any buoys or lines on them, and this way nobody could steal my fish. And so I'd go out and do the fish collecting, and I had these kind of barrels that they went in, and I was selling this stuff to the Key West aquarium. And then what happened, of course, because I couldn't drive, my father found a guy who was a young naval officer. He was an ensign. He was probably only about 22 or 23 years old. And I ended up hiring him, who at the time I was 11, he probably would have been 10 years older than me. And I was paying him, money every week to drive me to these locations to drop off my fish. The hilarious thing was that I was making more money as an 11-year-old than this junior naval officer was, which my father found endlessly hilarious. And then when we started, they asked us if we could do collections of sharks, and I said sure, and what we did was we kind of baited them into some special traps that we made, and it all worked out fine, except of course we had to move the sharks very quickly, because otherwise they would essentially drown in the water if they didn't move around, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But we managed to make all that work, and we ended up moving sharks all over the place, and it was a very successful business. And there were times, and you got to remember, you got to put this in perspective, guys. Back in it would have been early 1961, when I had just turned 10, 10 years old, and it just ballooned into a business where sometimes I'd make $120 a week. Well, that was more than a junior naval officer made then. It was hilarious. I couldn't believe my individual good fortune. Another thing that I just have to drop in, because it was so special to me, was it was such an honor. Later in life, I got to meet Lloyd Bridges, the guy who was the star of Sea Hunt. And
your inspiration right at the start.
Absolutely. And he was just a very wonderful guy to have a chance to talk with. He came down to visit me in the Virgin Islands in 1974, and I took him scuba diving. It was recommended by a guy named Dick Anderson, who was from Southern California. And Dick was a diving pioneer who worked on Sea Hunt's location stuff and did stunt stuff and all kinds of things like that. But it was just so exciting to hook up with these guys originally, Real honor.
How did I still can't get my head around the fact that these aquariums and sea centers and what have you went to an 11-year-old boy, 10, 11-year-old boy? Was there nobody else they could go to? And what did you do? Did you just turn up and say, would you like to buy a fish?
Well, actually, my father took me to the Key West Aquarium, which was this, paid aquarium exhibit. And I just thought it was fascinating. I was seeing all this stuff underwater anyway. And my father got a big kick out of it. And he used to go snorkeling with me all the time. And then when I got my YMCA certification, I asked him, I said, would it be okay if I go out and do some of this fish collecting stuff that I'm doing? And he had no problem with it at all. He was letting me go out and do things independently, and it worked. I think that he carefully vetted what I was doing and how I was going to proceed, and pretty much turned me loose. And it worked out. It worked out extremely well. I enjoyed what I was doing. Yeah. I enjoyed interacting with the marine life, and my father was a wonderful, wonderful mentor who educated me on so many things, not only just diving, but also, maritime stuff. And I ended up becoming an unlimited merchant marine master, and, ran cruise ship companies and all kinds of things like that. One thing is for certain, as my father commented way back, was he said, I'm not exactly sure what your destiny is, but I don't think you're going to be selling life insurance.
Your formative years had two key factors. First of all, the diving from a very early age, and second of all, handling boats. And I think it clearly doing those two things at such an early age has led you to the life that we're going to now talk about, and why you were such how you were such a pioneer in the dive industry. So moving on a little bit, you mentioned the Navy. So you went into, because your dad was a naval aviator, wasn't he?
That's correct. And my father went to the Naval Academy. He entered in 1941. Subsequently, he was commissioned as a naval officer and originally was assigned to a minesweeping team in Alaska. But that's not what he wanted to do. He wanted to pursue a path of an aviator. And so that's what he was doing. And I just, my father went down the path of flight and all that other stuff, but all of my interests took me underwater. And so that's pretty much where I went. Although, of course, I was simultaneously involved in both the diving industry itself and the operational side of diving, which involves boats and ships and various different types of operations. And so that's what my entire business model was based on. And the way we did things was a lot different than the era that you would probably remember. And the reason I bring this up right away was, see, I started out it was 50 years ago. 50 years ago, in January of 1971, was when I joined the Navy Experimental Diving Program, and we were filming fast attack nuclear submarines in extreme depths. In fact, our description of the project, initially they overviewed this and told us that one of the things that they wanted us to do was to be able to get below what is called the deep scattering layer. And that is a thermocline layer that occurs in those latitudes in the tropics, between about 500 and 525 feet of depth. And once you're under that thermocline at the deep scattering layer, submarines can sort of hide underneath that because the sonar pings bounce off the deep scattering layer. And this was the whole purpose of what we were doing, because we needed to film these submarines at anything from crawl speeds, dead slow, to high speeds when they would leap ahead of the ballistic submarines and then go back into complete silence again while they waited for the Soviet submarines to move on. And so what we realized, our three-man diving team in 1971 realized, was that we were unquestionably expendable, okay? It sounds a little grim, but what we did was, now see, I originally was born at the Naval Academy. My father was assigned there, and it's amazing that I ended up being born there. I originally had an appointment to the Naval Academy, and of all things, failed the eye test. You had to have perfect uncorrected vision back then. And when I was given my commission to the Naval Academy, I didn't have any idea that I had slight deficiencies in my visual, my vision, if you will, wearing glasses or something like that. And I ended up getting another full military scholarship from the ROTC. And the hilarious thing was that ultimately I got traded back to the Army. And I would have been commissioned as an Army officer and almost certainly sent to Vietnam. That's where everybody got sent in 1969, okay? But because of my diving and my filming background, the Navy came basically to interview me and asked if I would be interested in volunteering on this deep diving project. And it seemed, I went back and discussed it with my father, and he said, I'm not exactly sure what they want you to do, but I think that you will probably be safer in the long run if you remain in the Navy diving program and stay out of Vietnam. Best advice I ever got. Sure. But here's where it really gets incredible. I had a full scholarship to the for the ROTC, and I had a 6-year military commitment. I had to do 6 years of military service, and because we changed the way that the Navy operational systems were run for deep diving, we finished their project way ahead of schedule. In fact, we finished in before the end of June in 1971, and originally they had put a time frame on that project that they thought it was going to run between 2 to 3 years. We finished it in just about 7 months, and I got honorably discharged. I was out. I didn't have any further obligation to anything. They basically said, "You guys did a great job. We couldn't ask you to go any deeper or any longer. Your film work came out fantastic, and you're out." And I just couldn't believe it, because now my whole life had changed. I was not being sent to Vietnam. And I then went into commercial diving stuff, and later on took over the division of an industrial gas company and ran the entire diving division for them. And then approximately about a year later, I founded my first diving company called VI Divers, and the whole thing took off from there. And I started that with me, one employee. That was it. And
let me just, before we move on to that, Bret, let me just ask you, or it's not even a question, but a lot of people think that tech diving started in the mid-80s, Jim, late 80s. What gases were you diving on at 500 odd feet back in 1971? Well, I'm really interested to know.
Well, first of all, we didn't call it technical diving.
No, of course.
It didn't have a name. For us, it was just
diving.
It was part of the experimental diving program for us. We made some changes to several different things that the Navy originally had for protocols, simply because we were trying to accelerate the time of our decompression to get out of the water sooner. And it wasn't that we objected to the long hang times in the water. Well, it was the problems that we were having were with oceanic whitetips, sharks. There were literally hundreds of them in the water. And as soon as they activated the low frequency sound sonar to calibrate this stuff, when we're working with the subs, what happened was it's hard to explain. We were looking outside the box, if you will. But back in those days, everybody routinely used 100% oxygen at a depth of 30 feet. That was pretty standard, is what people were doing. Our breathing gas, for the most part, down to approximately 300 feet on air is what we used. That was standard. That was, standard. The PO2, our standard PO2 was, 2.0. And so we didn't
not to 300 foot. No,
not us. No, not us. We were well adjusted to it, and we really understood the physiology of it. We understood that we had to survive. If we were going to survive what we needed to do and get to these deeper depths, we had to change the way we did certain things. Again, we altered the decompression schedules from what was normal. We started to use, again, we didn't have a name for it. We didn't call it nitrox in those days. We called it oxy air. And what we were doing was we were using different nitrox mixes to basically facilitate more rapid decompression, protocols, and it was working fine. Again, the Navy pretty much left us alone because the priority was getting the job done and filming the submarines. Mm-hmm. And what was interesting about our experience was initially, when we first started doing the work, everything that was given to us came from the Navy purchasing list, and which essentially meant that we were using spun aluminum, what were called Navy 90s, that were 92 cubic feet. That was all fine. The problem that we had was we were being issued U.S. divers double hose regulators, And there was nothing wrong with that, except that we had no way of integrating a submersible pressure gauge to them. So we had no idea how much remaining gas supply that we had. And we were using we were using sometimes single 90s, sometimes triple 90s. And as we got into deeper water and our work of breathing accelerated, we finally got to the point where we had to very diplomatically go back to the Navy and say, we need this specialized equipment. And then, of course, their reaction immediately was, you can't get anything if it's not on the purchasing list. And which meant that there was some equipment that we really wanted. We didn't know this manufacturer at the time, but we had seen some of their equipment and we had used it, and we were extremely impressed. And it was a company called Scuba Pro, okay? And at the time, they had just introduced a piston regulator that had 2 low pressure ports and 2 high pressure ports. Now, this was revolutionary because now we could put in a submersible pressure gauge, and we had another low pressure hose that we could hook up to a some type of buoyancy device, whether it was, you know, around back in those days, in the very early stages of it, we used buoy fenzies because they worked out just fine. But it wasn't until I'd say about 2-3 months later, that they came out with the first BC that went around your neck and stuff like that. And it worked out really well. But now all of a sudden, we wanted this equipment. We wanted these Mark V regulators. We wanted submersible pressure gauges, and we wanted this new device that we didn't even know what they called it then. They didn't call it a buoyancy compensator. Oh, I just got a notice here that says our meeting has been upgraded by the host, and okay, you guys saw all that. Okay.
Yeah.
So
we don't have to change.
I find it absolutely amazing that you not only did you go to sort of extreme depths on air, you didn't even know how much bloody air you had.
Well, eventually, when we did get the Mark V regulators, we did get the submersible pressure gauges, and that's what let us, have some, control over what we were doing. Because when you don't know how much air you have remaining, that is
it's quite fundamental.
That's a very sobering reality, And again, we're not talking about diving to 250 feet or something like that. Our target depth was between 500 and 525 feet. And the deepest depth that I ever attained was right about 530 feet, which is the deepest that I ever got. And in order to get to that depth, we finally figured out that it was going to be more efficient from a safety standpoint if we simply got in one of the submarines and locked out from the forward torpedo room hatch. And then because of the size of our equipment package, you couldn't, I'm a big guy. I was a football player and all this stuff, but I'm about 6'1", and I weigh about 270 some pounds. Back in that era, probably about 240. And but the thing was, trying to fit someone my size in the escape trunk of the submarine was ridiculous. But what I did was I was able to get in there, and then once I was up inside the the escape trunk, if you will, they then pushed up the triple 90s into the same space. And so I was able to open the top hatch, exit onto the deck of the submarine, and then reach back down in and drag my equipment out, get into it, and off I'd go and do the shooting. And it worked out. It managed to work out. I think that to some degree, I think the Navy just simply, one, they were happy with what we were doing, but I don't think that they really wanted to get directly involved with what we were doing, because as I had said before, there was really no doubt in our minds that we were expendable. If we could get the job done, that was great. But otherwise, they most likely would bring in other people, and who knows how the stuff was going to work. And it all did work out. And again, we finished the project on time, way ahead of schedule, and I was able to get out early. But the other thing that you'll get just a bit of a laugh out of, when we could not originally get Scuba Pro equipment, we asked the ship's executive officer on location down in the Virgin Islands, we asked him if he could simply go into the discretionary funds locker or whatever, and we needed some money to buy this equipment that we couldn't get from the Navy purchasing list. And the officer said, well, what do you need? And I said, well, there is a dive store in San Diego, California, and they've got what we need. And sending naval officers back and forth by the planes was a piece of cake. And so sure enough, we just asked this guy if he would go in and get this stuff. And he went into Chuck Nicklin's dive store called the Diving Locker in 1971 and bought us, let's see, we ended up with 3 Mark V's and the pressure gauges and the BCs and all this stuff. And another thing that we ended up getting as well was the SOS decompression meter, which at the time, we had no use for it on mixed gas, but it worked out very well for us down to about 180 feet. But it changed everything, and getting the equipment through Chuck Nicklin's facility was just unheard of at the time. But again, because we got the results that the Navy wanted, they left us alone.
Just let you get on with it.
They let us get on with it. Yeah.
So when that project came to an end, that was when you started VI Divers?
Well, when I first got done with the Navy project, I was doing commercial diving stuff. And I did that for, I don't know, a number of months. And then I was asked to join this company that wanted to start up a diving division of their industrial gas company, who, what their primary business was supplying everything from oxygen to compressed air, and it was a logical connection for them. And so we started up a separate facility that was adjacent to the industrial gas plant, and it became a very successful retail training and diving operation. And then after that, after I've been doing that for a year, I decided to leave them and start my own company. And that's what I did at the ripe old age of 22.
So VI Divers was a very successful company. It grew to quite a big fleet, and one boat in particular was absolutely massive.
Yes, the astounding thing about, well, VI Divers, which I started in 1973, it began modestly, and we changed locations twice and eventually moved into another facility that was called the Pan Am Pavilion, which is right down on the waterfront in Christiansted, St. Croix. It was one of the best decisions I ever made to move there, because originally I was paying about $150 a month in rent for my retail facility. I moved to what was called the Pan Am Pavilion, which was this fantastic retail site right on the waterfront and everything. And I'm sorry, I'm trying not to make let this phone bother me. So when I moved to the Pan Am Pavilion in late 1975, there was a breakthrough moment when we moved in there. It changed everything so much because we had all this space. I had completely changed the way that most people make diving retail facilities look. Instead of, I don't know how you would really describe it, but the overall theme of our facility was all framed underwater photography and scenics and stuff like this. And what we found out was we could entice people in and get them to come into our facility, and they'd be totally captivated by all of the pictures that were on the facility. You know, everything from sharks to whales to coral reef stuff, and everything was on. This facility was so big, and we had, and the ceiling was, I think, if I remember, I think it was close to 30 feet high because it was a two-story building and it was very much open. And so essentially we had this beautiful gallery display of our works. And then everybody would come in, and of course they're buying mast, fins, snorkel, they're looking at regulators, they're looking at tanks, T-shirts, everything you can possibly imagine. But the initial incentive to bring that customer in the door was to captivate them with the underwater world that we were going to preview to them. And that's
Sell the dream, selling the dream.
And what is astounding, again, rolling the clock back, but 1976 was the first year ever that my company grossed over $1 million. Now, in turning, again, to put this into reality, those numbers are unbelievable for that era. In 1976, to do $1 million in sales, that was just unheard of for a diving operation. Nobody could believe it.
Yeah.
And then,
Bret, if I may, to put that into perspective,
yeah,
that's $6 million a year today.
Oh, I hadn't even tried to do the math.
In today's money, that's about $6 million a year for a dive operation.
By the time the company matured, we were running right around 5 to 6 million a year. And I sold the company in 1985. I also sold the yacht charter fleet. And then in 1987, 2 years after I had sold the yacht fleet and the diving operation, that's when I decided to do the concept with the diving cruise ship. Now, it was not, again, it was not like a liveaboard or anything like this. This ship originally was the flagship for Norwegian Cruise Lines. It was the Sunward One. And we bought it after it had been in operation. And the idea that I was looking for was I wanted what's called a ro-ro vessel, R-O-R-O. That means roll on, roll off. Okay, good. I'm glad you guys know that, what that means. And of course, the business model for Norwegian Cruise Lines then, they were leaving out of ports in the UK and going to the Mediterranean for the most part, visiting everything from, France to Monte Carlo to Italy to Greece, blah, blah, blah. And what they were doing was they'd come into these ports, they'd usually spend a couple of days, and they had all these lovely chauffeured limousines and Cadillacs and Mercedes. And the back of the ship, the ramp would come down and the cars would drive off, and off they would go to do their, fun cruise ship stuff. Well, when I saw that ship, I thought it was perfect for what we wanted, because I had to get 10 38-foot diesel dive boats into the back of that ship. And it worked out fine because the ro-ro design was perfect for us. Then I modified, I wanted to change the way the ship was laid out.
Can we just give everybody a bit of perspective here? This ship or boat or whatever you want to call it that you bought was not just, it was big. It was 152 meters long, 18,000 tons and 10 stories high as a dive boat.
Yes, it's a big ship. Yes,
as a dive boat.
Yeah.
Well, I'll put it in perspective for you. When I'd say the first month that we had guests on board the ship, they had no idea how big a ship they were going to get on. It was beyond their conception. And then what would happen is they would get lost on the decks. And they couldn't find their way, and we finally had to install these red phones that we put all over the ship, and they could pick up the phone no matter where they were and ask directions of how to find their way to either a stairwell or an elevator, so they could get back to get out of the housing area.
I think there's a bigger concern, Bret, is doing a giant stride off the top of the boat.
Oh, that wasn't going to happen. But another thing that I'll never forget, when we hosted but when we were at the DEMA show in 1988, we were about to start the program up and everything. And it was so amusing to us at the time because we had all these people coming by our exhibit. We had quite a large exhibit there. In fact, we had brought all the way from New Orleans, we had brought over one of our 38-foot custom diesel dive boats and put it right in the exhibit so everybody could see it. This is what you'll be diving off of from our ship. And people would come by and they would look at, we had one photograph that we'd blown up of the ship that was about, oh God, it was probably close to 30 feet wide, big photo mural that we had made and incorporated into our booth. And the hilarious thing was we had people would stop by and they would look at the pictures of the ship. And then they would say things to us like, well, I don't really understand, the size of this boat. And I said, well, what don't you understand? And they said, well, is it as big as the Cayman Aggressor? And now you got to remember, the Cayman Aggressor was 110 feet long. And at the time, kind of with amusement, I said, our boat is a little bit bigger, okay? And I said, in fact, we can put the Cayman Aggressor in our swimming pool. And they just went, whoa, holy shit, And so this is the way things kind of worked out. And we had our own hyperbaric facility on board, a recompression chamber, full staff. We had a hospital on board. We had a attending physician. I ran all of the hyperbaric stuff on that ship, in addition to being the CEO and president of the company. But it was a very, very successful operation. We visited.
Let me ask you two questions.
Yeah, sure.
First question is, how many people could that boat hold in a like a week traveling around the Caribbean? And the second question is, what percentage of them were existing divers as opposed to first-time divers going on a ship thinking, I'm going to learn to dive, I'm going to have a week on a ship and learn to dive? What was the ratio?
Well, my business model was we did accommodate divers that were brand new, that were going to take certification training or that sort of thing. But my business model, that I was 37 years old then, and I was not interested in trying to create a business model that was traditional for cruise ships. It just wasn't of anything that interested me. You have to understand that in 1987, when I originally came up with the idea, the average age demographic of a customer for the cruise ships in those days was 64 years old. Now, I just turned 70. Not that I feel old by any means at all, but you have to understand, rolling the clock back to 34 years ago, that that was fucking old, okay? 64 years old. I wasn't interested in trying to go after that market. No. I was interested in going after the market of people in their 20s to about their 50s, was where I thought that my numbers would fall. And as a result of that, we ended up with a business model that essentially embraced active scuba divers. We didn't put any limitations on them. We didn't have any limitations on decompression. We issued every single diver on the boat, we issued them electronic dive computers of the era, because we felt that the decompression algorithm for that model was going to be conservative enough that we were very, very confident that this was something that was going to work very effectively, because you have to remember, we offered people 4 dives a day. And one day a week we did 5 because we have night dive. And so if people were using dive computers of that era, and the only ones that we really used at the time were called Decor Microbrains. And I don't remember who actually manufactured them. They were an OEM device, but they had a Buhlmann P5 program, decompression program in them. And they were very well designed. They were conservative. And in the entire time that we ran that operation, we did close to 250,000 dives. And for those that were diving on the electronic dive computers, we didn't have a single case of bends, not one, the entire time. The only people that ever had a DCS incident were those that were diving square profiles on dive tables. And we effectively treated every single one of them immediately because we had a full hyperbaric system on board the ship, and we resolved all their problems. But it was amazing to look back at this in the era and realize the astounding innovations of technology that had just fallen into our lap. The idea that we had electronic dive computers that could run these multi-level programs with adaptive, changeable decompression algorithms, that was almost beyond our conception. And it increased the safety of the sport so much, it was unbelievable. Now, we had 10 dive boats that carried 18 people on board those boats. And they were doing an average of 4 dives a day. And we visited Cozumel, Mexico, the 2 atolls off of Belize, and then we visited Roatan and Guanaja in the Bay Islands of Honduras. And we had boats that were set aside specifically for photographers, specifically for people that wanted to explore the deeper drop-off depths and stuff like that. We had stuff deliberately for people that would fall in the less than 60-foot depth ranges and stuff like that. We tried to customize every aspect of what we did to make it most enjoyable for them, explain exactly what they needed to do. And again, it was beyond the conceptions of just about everybody that we would come out and do our briefing on the first day when we were at sea, because we had left the port of New Orleans and we had a day and a half to go down to Cozumel. And so at sea that day, we would do all of our orientations. And people just couldn't believe that we didn't have depth limits. They couldn't believe that they were allowed to do decompression diving. This was beyond their conceptions. And the reason that we wanted to go down that path was we did not want anybody concealing what they were doing. We wanted to say, hey, it's an open door. If you want to go down the deep drop-offs and do that stuff, fine. If you want to do decompression diving, that's fine. If you want to do, whatever it may be, you're welcome to do it. But just do this with every protocol of safety that we can. And then one of the most revolutionary things that we did was I bought, I think it was, I bought 500 of the Daycore microbrain computers. And then they essentially were given to our guests at no charge. And we ran a special, it was a brief, 1.5 hour seminar on diving computers to get them fully up to speed on it. And so they knew what they were looking at. And another thing that was just revolutionary at the time, but you guys probably remember the era of, the big electronic dive computer that was called the Edge? Do you remember that? You guys are there? I lost sound.
Yeah.
I lost you. I'm sorry, Craig. Go ahead.
It was me. That was the computer that took up your whole forearm. It was like a brick, a house brick.
You're right. The thing was huge. And but one of the things that it had and its successors had was you had to turn it on manually. And you won't believe how many people would go in the water and begin their dives and would forget they had turned their goddamn computer on. And it was insane. And so in 1988, when I was trying to evaluate this new edition of dive computers and the technology, one of the things that impressed the shit out of me was they had now come up with an immersion switch that actually worked. And so when people strapped on the dive computer, not only did the immersion switch activate the computer, but there was a depth function that automatically activated the computer as well if it went below a depth of 3 feet. And so all of a sudden, all these little elements of safety got incorporated into the things that we wanted. And the input that I was able to go back and forth with to Dr. Albert Buhlman, it just changed the way everybody dived at the time. And yet you still had people that were ultra conservatives from elements of the diving industry that wanted nothing to do with electronic dive computers. They didn't want anything to do with nitrox. They wanted nothing to do with technical diving, which at that point still didn't have a name. Okay. For us, it was the
Diving.
type of diving that we did as a matter of routine. We never really gave it a lot of thought. And then I think it was late 1989 or maybe 1990 that the term tech diving got started. And you know, a lot of us that, again, at the time I was 39 then, which was young by most standards. But again, guys like me and Tom Mount and Jim Bowden and all these, we were working in these depths and doing penetrations in caves and wrecks and simply in some cases, a lot of the cave systems that we were going into some parts of the Bay Islands of Honduras and Belize, we were doing this as a matter of routine and never really gave a lot of thought to it because our methodology was solid. What was scaring the shit out of us was the people that did not come from our backgrounds and had sort of, you know, put their foot in this initial interest in tech diving, but they really didn't, in many cases, have the experience.
They weren't prepared.
If you look back at the number of fatalities that occurred in the, say, from about 1990 to about 1996 or so, the death rate was astounding. And most of it was occurring on the North Atlantic wrecks, including the Andrea Doria
and
the U-159 or whatever the hell, 169. Yep. And these people would get trapped inside the ships because they didn't use reels and lines. And there was just this astounding fatality rate and incident rate, and it scared the crap out of us. And for quite a while, there were a number of us that simply declined to participate in these discussions. Finally, in 1992, I was asked by the publishers of Watersport Publishing, and they wanted me to write this book called Deep Diving, and I finally agreed to do it. I did it with some other co-authors who were not really up to the task, but after we released the initial first edition, I upgraded it substantially, and the size of the book increased to over 500 some pages. And
it's
then
on my shelf just there.
Well, then it became hugely popular and just ran away with sales. To this, the last time I checked, and this is before the pandemic started, but that book is now sold over 100,000 copies in 7 languages. That's a little hard to believe, I got to tell you. And I did another book called Mixed Gas Diving with Tom Mount. But what we were trying to do was give the people good information that they could understand without making it overly technical. And I'm not talking about technical diving. I'm talking about the physiology and physics of diving, which was going over a lot of people's heads. And what I was trying to do with that book was put it into language that everybody could understand.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a copy of your book, and even though you wrote that back in the early 90s, there's stuff that I'm reading now that is so relevant to your attitude when you go deep diving, and and how you should be prepared for that. And I think that leads us on really nicely to going really deep. You actually held a world record in those times, in the early 90s. I'll let you tell the listeners and the viewers the depth you went to, Bret. Tell us about the world record attempt.
Well, the deepest that I did in that particular era, that was February 14th, 1990, 31 years ago. What prompted that particular dive was there was a lawyer named Peter Hess, who was a member of the Explorers Club and a really interesting fella. And he was trying to work with some other lawyers to get NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, to approve and allow diving to take place on the wreck of the Monitor, which sunk off of North Carolina and was lying in about 220 feet of depth. And when Peter Hess came down to discuss this with me, he had to fly down from Delaware or someplace and come visit me on the ship because I was only in port for about 6 hours before we left again. And he wanted to know if he could interview me in a legal brief and talk about the fact that I can go to twice the working depth of this wreck that was at 220 feet. And if I could do that with the equipment that I was using, why can't divers be allowed to go half that depth? Right. And that was the argument that they actually made to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court accepted it. And it ended up opening up diving on the wreck of the Monitor. And so when I was listening to Peter Hess about all this, and we were talking about, you know, the way that he would essentially try to get this through the bureaucracy of the system, I went back to a gentleman named Randy Borer that I had met aboard the ship. And he was assisting me at the time with the algorithmic development of the table program that I wanted to use. Because remember, although we were using electronic dive computers at that time, I was using a what was one of the early Uvatech computers. It was actually, you know, under the brand of Bouchot, but it was an Uvatech computer. And that particular algorithm matched up very, very nicely. Me and, do you remember Sheck Exley, the cave diver?
Very famous diver, yeah.
Yeah, Sheck was one of the all-time best. And he and I would go back and forth because Sheck had a remarkable ability in computer understanding and stuff like that, that was way beyond the capabilities of many of the rest of this. And I would reach out to guys like Dr. Buellman and to Bill Hamilton and this sort of thing and try to, you know, basically get a grip on this. But on that particular dive, I went to 452 feet and I didn't have any issues at all. I was very, very conscious of the fact that I had to minimize any level of exertion, keep my work of breathing down, and make absolutely certain that nothing was going to trigger any problems at all with oxygen toxicity. I have an extreme tolerance for narcosis. And on the dive that I did back in 1990, I really didn't have any problems. Yes, there is some degree of delayed impairment or whatever you want to call it, but I actually filled out a slate when I arrived at depth and answered some questions that I hadn't seen before, the questions and little math questions and things like this. And because they were trying to assess what my cognitive ability really was going to be. And, I didn't have any problems. Now, later on, I ended up doing another dive to 475 feet and then another one to just below 500. And again, those dives were not related to trying to do any records or anything like that. One of the dives was related to a deep film project that I was doing on a commercial diving project, but we were diving it on air because we had no access to helium, okay, at the time in this remote area. And then again, in I think it was 1992, I was filming humpback whales, and they were basically around me and hanging out, and I was wearing a set of doubles, but I really was not anticipating any deep diving at all. I just wanted a long duration time on my doubles because I figured I was going to be in the water with the whales for probably a couple hours anyway, you know. Well, it turned out that I hadn't been with them for more than about 5 minutes or so. Then the group of whales decided to do a slow descent. And when they did, I simply followed them and they kept on going and I wasn't having any problems. And so when I finally reached just short of 500 feet, I stopped and I came back up, and that ended up being the deepest dive on air that I'd ever done. But again, the impairment levels for some people are vastly different. Now you take a guy like Jim Bowden, and he's almost bulletproof. He just was like me. Tom Mount, the same way. Joe Odom, same way. And yet Sheck Exley, who was one of my best friends and who was one of the best divers I ever knew Scheck had major problems with narcosis. He was very, very susceptible to narcosis, and realized very early on that he needed to make that switch to mixed gas.
To
And it
mixed
was
gases.
I get off my face at 20 foot.
What's that?
I get off my face at 20 foot.
Not quite that bad, but yeah, Jim can get narked quite badly at 100 foot. But to put that in perspective for those in Europe, 452 foot on air is 140 meters.
Yeah.
Just for those in Europe. But you know, that's quite incredible.
Really.
How deep is that in furlongs per fortnight?
Funny you should ask that, because I actually have that written down on my no idea.
I'll never forget one time we were delivering when we were bringing the Ocean Quest ship over from Singapore, and I had virtually all of my officers and staff, the engineers and the deck officers, etc. They were either Italian, Greek, or Norwegian. Okay, I was the only U.S. officer on board the ship, and we constantly were going back and forth between conversions from everything from meters to feet to whatever it might be. And the funny thing was, I'll never forget, I had this one Italian captain on board, and we had to go around Cape. The Cape of Africa, and then cross the Atlantic to get back over to New Orleans in North America. And this guy was asking me something about what I thought would be our attainable cruising speed on this particular segment of it, because we were going to enter a different type of current pattern and stuff like that. And I said, well, I'm predicting that we should be able to do the voyage in so many, and I said, furlongs per fortnight. And these guys would look at me like I was completely out of my mind. They had no idea what I was talking about. And for you UK guys, a furlong and a fortnight is a type of term that nobody uses, even in America. And you guys are cracking up. And meanwhile, I've got these Greek guys and these Italian guys so totally confused, it was hilarious.
I mean, Bret, up until this point, you've obviously gained so much experience in so many different areas. You've gained a lot of information and data. So you've got this passion for wanting to let people know, obviously with the book like Deep Diving, of what they need to do in the protocols and getting that information and data out there. Is that what led you to founding some of the training agencies?
Oh, no question about it. In 1991, Dick Rakowski founded IAND, which was the nitrox training agency. And I've been working with Dick since 1976, okay? And his concept of putting together a nitrox program made complete sense, okay? And what he did was he reached out to me, Tom Mount, and Billy Deans, and asked us if we wanted to come into the company and basically run it, from there. And the only thing that we really changed was the name of the company, and it became IANTD, for International Association of Nitrox and Technical Divers. And then we continued on that path, but I am something of a perfectionist, and there were some issues with curriculum and training materials that I wasn't in complete agreement with. And so I basically just said to Tom Mount, I said, Tom, I think I want to go in a different direction, and I'm gonna exit, if that's okay with you. And he said, okay. Now you have to remember, at the same time, I was the chairman of the board of NAUI, which was at the time one of the largest training agencies in the world. I was the chairman of the board. I was trying to get NAUI to put their foot in and accept computers, nitrox, dive computers.
All of the advancements, all of the new technology that was going on.
Exactly. And I could not get that board of directors to get a grip on the reality of where the industry was going. And so I just kind of gave up on them. And I continued as the chairman of the board. But when they told me that they did not want to go down this path and embrace these other technologies and innovations, I decided to found TDI, Technical Diving International. I did that in April of 1994, and it just took off.
So we touched on it earlier.
Yeah.
In those early days, there wasn't such a thing as technical diving. It hadn't come about. So for those that want to know where it came from, I think it was our episode 18 was with Michael Menduno, who actually first coined the phrase technical diving. So I just wanted to obviously let people know, if they want to find out more, go back and look at and listen to our previous podcast.
Yeah, Michael.
He's good at this, isn't he? He's good at this.
Michael had Michael Menduno, who started AquaCorp magazine, which is just a little, paper thing, that went out, but it had a lot of good information in it. And I think that probably one of the single best contributions that he actually made was creating the term tech diving, because, or technical diving, because it was out of the spectrum of most people's understanding and awareness. And for those of us that came from Navy, military, commercial, and scientific diving, like me, including saturation diving, it was a world that we lived in that other people didn't, and trying to go back and explain what we were doing, it was very difficult, as I brought up before, because there was a huge segment of the wreck diving community that were good divers, okay, but didn't come from the protocols that so many of us were used to, like, for instance, reels, lines, different protocols for penetration, how you were going to do certain things, especially with your exit strategies out of wrecks or caves or whatever. This was completely foreign to so many people. And initially, I remember so vividly that Jim Bowden and Sheck Exley and Tom Mount and people like that, we just simply didn't want to get involved with that group of divers. And it was finally pointed out to us that it was our era not to get involved and help with the education and the informational side of things. And the guy that explained it best to us was Bill Hamilton. You'll probably remember Bill. He passed away in 2011, but he was one of my dearest friends. Our friendship went all the way back to 1971. And what Bill was encouraging us to do was explain it in a way that the regular diving population can understand it. And he said, Bret, he said, you're writing stuff that is in a style that people can understand in everyday language. Almost everything else that's out there is either coming from scientific papers or books or medical papers and books on physiology. And this is what is missing. We need to bring these people in and have them get this understanding. And well, you just can't imagine what it was like back in 1992 to try to delve into a subject like, for instance, OTUs, okay, oxygen tolerance units. When I throw in things out there like that and explain to them, this is what your dosage is going to be for oxygen, people would stare at me and they would they had no idea what I was talking about. And then when I finally did release them, yeah.
I think that the really good thing that Aquanauts did was give it a tag, give it a label, because that enabled it to be separated from leisure diving. That okay, you can do this, but this is something different, and this is something you need bigger skills and you need to learn more about. And giving it a name separated it just from leisure diving, and I think that was a really good thing to happen at that time.
Yes, I completely agree. The importance of not only education, but information that can that can get delivered into these segments was so important. And what we saw, it changed everything. I mean, by the time that INTD and TDI and Andy got started up, although Andy became a tiny thing compared to TDI. I mean, even INTD is a tiny little company compared now to the TDI conglomerate, which consists of Scuba Diving International, SDI, ERDI, which is Emergency Rescue Diving Inc. And then we also do a program that certifies and trains the divers that are involved in the university programs and scientific programs and stuff like that. So it's quite a conglomerate. And I don't know exactly how many instructors are out there these days, but I would guess the number is probably close to 25,000 active instructors. That's
Are you still involved with TDI?
I beg your pardon?
Are you still involved with TDI?
Well, I founded the company and I ran it for a decade, and then I sold it in February of 2004. I sold it to the investment group run by Brian Carney, which then took over the company and continued to do extremely well. And they have expanded greatly. And I wish them nothing but the best. They've done a great job. It's now been 27 years, since I founded the company, and it's continuing its growth, even in this horrible reality of the pandemic. That company is still showing growth. It is pulling in the numbers. Meanwhile, so much of the diving industry is in a real crisis. It's very sad.
Talking about crisis, Brett, we've touched on some of the fantastic highlights of just an incredible career. It hasn't always been plain sailing. You were unfortunately involved in a shark attack that had some dire consequences. Are you happy to talk about that? Will you tell us that story?
Well, yes. I mean, I'll tell you what happened. It's not a fun story.
Not at all.
We were diving. Yeah, we were diving on a university-based project that was involving recovery of specimens in deep fish traps and other things like this. It was a totally mundane operation as far as we were concerned. We were working around 180, 190 feet, something like that, not deep for us. And what we were surprised to see on that particular day, which if I remember correctly, I think it was October 14th, 1972. What surprised us on that particular day in our three-man diving group was all of a sudden, out of nowhere, on the edge of the drop-off, we encountered two quite large oceanic white-tip sharks. And they were in the probably close to 12 to 14 foot range. You don't see them that big anymore. And we were kind of looking at them, and we were very familiar with the species. We dove with them all the time out in the open ocean, particularly when we were doing the military stuff. But on that particular day, these sharks came by us, and we kind of watched them as they went by, and we just moved on. We didn't really give it much thought. Anyway, as we were concluding the end of our dive and getting ready to make our ascent, our third dive team member was just down a little bit longer than the rest of us, and that's no big deal in this type of diving. But one of the guys had ascended to a depth of about probably 100 feet, and was getting ready to enter the decompression schedule, and we were sort of waiting on this third guy. And we couldn't see him. The bottom seemed to be disturbed, and there was a lot of particulate in the water. And I thought maybe he'd had a hose problem or something like that. And so I told this one guy, McIlvain, you stay here, because he was running a little low on air. And I went back to see what was going on. And when I swam into the mess that was occurring on the sandy bottom, I bumped into Rod Temple, and I didn't realize what was going on because the visibility was almost completely obscured. And what was going on was he was being attacked by two oceanic white-tip sharks. I didn't even see them. I was just trying to make contact with the guy, and I grabbed him by his left shoulder and started to basically pull him up and begin to ascend. that was when we got out of the murky part of the water. I then saw the sharks and realized that this was not, a busted hose or something like this. This was an attack. And so I kept trying. What's that?
Two at the same time. Both were attacking him.
Two at the same time. They were biting him. They were biting him repeatedly on his left leg, usually the upper part of the thigh and the lower part of the calf. And this is where the attack started. And with shark behavior, if you ever read about the subject much at all, when sharks are actually engaged in an attack, they rarely ever bite somebody else that's involved in it. Okay. And what they actually were doing was the sharks were actually forcing me out of the way and trying to get a better angle of attack on Rod. And so I kept trying to drag him up. The third guy in our team, McIlvaine, who I had sent up to a shallower depth, we disappeared again into the particulate when we fell back down on the sandy bottom at about 200 some feet. And McIlvaine lost sight of us. He couldn't see us. And he thought we were gone. He thought we were dead. What had happened to us was the sharks had come back and repeatedly hit us. And they were essentially hitting Rod, and they were towing us over the edge of the drop-off. And as we continued to, go down over the drop-off, the sharks are coming back and hitting him repetitively. And at one point, we probably were down at a depth of about, I'm guessing probably 280 feet or something like that. And Rod actually tried to push me away. We had a brief period when the sharks backed off and they just swam around in the clear water. And he kind of pushed me away like he was trying to tell me, you can't save me, go back up, and that was not my attitude. And so I reached out to him again and began to try to swim him up. And the sharks attacked us again. And then there was a prolonged period where we were dragged over the drop off. My depth gauge at the time, which was a Scuba Pro depth gauge, which locked at 325 feet on the display face. So I was pegged at 325 feet and obviously had gone deeper. I don't know what depth I actually ended up at. I have no idea. But at one point, Rod was torn away from me. He was torn out of my arms and went over the drop off, and he was dead. There wasn't much question about it. At one point, I was trying to reach in and grab him by his harness to get a better grip on him and bring him up. And when I reached down in the area of his harness and abdomen and stuff like that, I realized that he had been bitten severely in the abdomen and he was unconscious and unresponsive. And he got torn out of my arms and off he went. And then just a matter of maybe a minute after that happened, I ran out of air. And so I began ascending.
So sorry, Bret, what depth are you at now where you've run out of air?
Well, the depth gauge pegged at 325.
So you're below that still?
I was below that still, yeah.
Out of air.
And when I was swimming upwards, trying to get up, I can remember looking down at the depth gauge on my wrist, and I still was pegged at 325. I don't know how deep I went. It could very well have been 380, 395. I don't have any idea. But I remember looking as I swam up at my depth gauge and never once ever saw the peg, relieved. And so as I began ascending, I was getting into shallower water, shallower depths really, but I was down deep. And then I would get a breath about I'd get one breath about every minute, maybe, as I came back up, as I was ascending, the pressure relieved in the tank, and I'd get a little bit of something to breathe. And as I'm heading up, I kind of remember, it's hard to say what your memory really does, but all I was concentrating on that point was trying to get back to the surface alive. And I just remember looking up, kicking in a wide, steady stroke, and thinking, you know, can I do this? Can this be done? And I remember also, because of the hypoxia, that, you know, I was running out of air. I had practically had nothing to breathe. And I remember looking through this kind of diminishing circle of vision, if you will, because my vision was shutting down because of hypoxia. And so down I go. I'm looking through this kind of hole in my vision, and I don't know how deep I was, but I remember thinking at the time, damn, you know, I almost made it. And then I passed out. But what happened was there was just enough air in my BCD that allowed me some slight positive buoyancy, and it lifted me probably the last, I would say, 20 or 30 feet to the surface. And when I broke the surface, there was a differential, obviously, between the chest and the lungs and the head. And I exhaled, and that triggered a response to inhale and exhale again. And I basically came back to life. And so here I am up on the surface. And I know that I have missed an astounding amount of decompression. I don't have any idea how much decompression that I had missed, but I knew I had to get to shore. I was only about, maybe 100 yards from shore where the beach was. And so I started swimming to get to shore. I could gradually feel my legs going numb and this sort of thing. And when I got into about hip deep water, I stood up, put my pulled my mask off, and basically cried out for assistance and said, I've been involved in a diving accident. I need help immediately. I have decompression sickness, and my partner was killed. And so two people rushed in to help me. And as it turned out, one was a hyperbaric doctor from Miami, and his wife was a hyperbaric nurse. And so I passed out.
Well, it's not your time, Bret. It's not your time.
To be honest, I mean, it does sound very lucky, but I think your past has obviously played a massive part in that, and the experiences and the let's say training that you've had.
But what also was remarkable was, remember, I had to get medevaced out. I was in St. Croix, and in order to get me to the Navy chamber, which was in Roosevelt Roads Naval Station in Puerto Rico, they had to medevac me out in a chartered flight. And I had a doctor that was attending me in the plane, but I was completely unconscious at the time. They finally got me restored when they put me on 100% oxygen, but it took almost 20 minutes for me to even come back. They originally were going to take me to the hyperbaric facility at the naval station in Puerto Rico, on the east end of the island. But the problem was the chamber was full, and they had other Navy divers in there, and there wasn't room for me. And so they had to move me to another chamber facility that was in Rincon, Puerto Rico, at the very northwest end of the island. And so what happened was they were running low on oxygen. And of course, oxygen was the only thing that was going to sustain me until they could get me back under pressure in a chamber. And what happened was the doctor told the pilot that we got to get this guy on oxygen or he's going to die. And the pilot, to his everlasting credit, he called I guess the chief of police or something, and they shut down. There was this 4-lane highway that went across the island, east and west, and they shut down one of the lanes, and the plane landed on the highway outside of San Juan, Puerto Rico, and they took me out of the aircraft and put me in a Coast Guard helicopter, and then and brought oxygen to me and everything, which completely restored me again because I'm back on oxygen. And then they flew me to the chamber where I was treated for 2 days and eventually released. And the Navy flew me back on Monday. But it's remarkable in retrospect that I was able to survive it. It's truly, truly amazing.
Yeah, incredible story.
That story, that account has been, it's been written up in about 10 books. There have been 2 different documentary films that were made about it. And it's hard to believe it's been 49 years now, but that shark attack incident is in just about everything that everybody has ever read. You know, I was so lucky not only to survive it, but see, here's the other thing. There's a bit of irony here. Robbie McIlvaine, who was the third diver on that dive that I had sent up early because he was low on air, Robbie never saw us in the mess that was going on in the bottom. And when the sharks dragged us over the drop off, he didn't see us go. And so the last that he saw of us was the struggle that was going on the bottom as the sharks were towing me over the drop off with Rod Temple. And so Robbie, who was up at the 50-foot decompression stop, Robbie witnessed this whole thing in horror. And when he finally surfaced, he came ashore. Now, by that time, I'd been medevaced out because he had an hour and a half of decompression to do. When he finally got to shore, the doctor and the nurse had gone with the medevac unit. I was gone, okay? And Robbie reported both of us dead. And nobody knew any different because back in those days, we didn't even have telephones in most places. I had no way of contacting people in my own professional group, much less my father, who lived in St. Croix. And when I was being taken from the airport after being flown back by the Navy, I didn't have any money. I had a borrowed pair of jeans and a pair of flip-flops and a t-shirt or something like that. And I was dropped off at the airport in St. Croix, and I just waved a cab down, and he said, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "Well, take me over here to this place in Frederickstead." It was where my father lived. And so as we were heading over there, it was about a 20-minute ride. And as we were going by this one place, it was like a beach bar on the beach, etc., on a Monday afternoon. And I said, "Wait a minute." I said, "You can drop me off here." I said, "Because it's another 20 minutes up the road to my dad's house." And I said, "If you're okay with it," I said, "you know who I am." I said, I'll come out and pay your cab fare, the next day. And he said, "Okay, that's cool." So he dropped me off, and I went into this beach club, thinking I could find somebody that could drive me up to my dad's. And I walked in on my own memorial service. And there were like 500 people there.
Scared the fuck out of half of them.
Yeah, it was unbelievable because I walked in and there were probably 500 people there. Obviously very sober, situation, a lot of grief and this sort of thing. And they were getting ready to float some wreaths out, as a memorial ceremony. And here I walk in the door and everybody's looking at me.
Yeah, so walking in on your own memorial, that must have just been quite something else. And of course, you couldn't have told anyone that you were okay.
Well, I did tell them I was okay.
Then you did, but not prior.
No. In fact, there were newspaper articles that were published on Sunday and Monday morning in some of the local papers. Again, that I kept them because, there was this headline on the front page of these two newspapers saying, 2 divers killed in shark attack. And it was, I wasn't dead, I was coming back, but I was in total isolation in Puerto Rico. And, it was just, again, there's some strange things that happen in life, but every now and then you kind of get a pass. And I was lucky to survive.
Absolutely. Well,
sorry, Craig. You said there was 2 documentaries about it. Do you know what they are called?
Yes, one of them, if I recall, it was a BBC program, and it was called Dead Men's Tales. I can't remember the name of the producer. Fascinating guy. I met him over in the UK, and it was called Dead Men's Tales. And he had brought together a group of people that all had survived sort of unsurvivable incidents. Everything from falling out of planes to people there was like some guy that got stuck underground in a French cave system for almost a month and survived down there and eventually got out. There were, you know, blah, blah, blah. But in my particular instance, they wanted to bring me in because of the shark attack incident. And that was in 1990. It was 1992. I'm pretty certain. You can probably Google it and find it. And then
in a minute.
I can't remember the other one, but I know definitely that was a BBC series that had all of these amazing stories about how people had survived these unbelievable circumstances. If I recall, the one that fascinated me the most, there was some guy that was in a plane that the pilot asked him to go back and make absolutely certain that the door was secured on the plane. You know, it had one of those drop down ramp sort of things. You know, it was a small craft. It was like maybe a 10-seater airplane or something like that. And this guy, who wasn't a pilot or a professional or anything, and there was only one pilot in the plane, and he went back and kind of pushed on the door to make sure that it was properly secured. Well, how stupid can you be? The door wasn't secured, and the door opened, and he fell out of the plane. No parachute, no nothing. And what saved him was the plane was flying from Switzerland over the Alps.
No.
And when he fell out, he actually fell about 1,500, 1,800 feet to the top of the incline on the Alps and kind of bounced his way down the face of the Alps and survived. I think the only real injuries he had was some lacerations and a sprained ankle. How do you do that? You know, it was crazy.
I mean, but then your story's just as remarkable, to be fair. To get through that and do that and survive it and unscathed. Oh, sorry, I got a bag twinge in my back that's been playing up. Yeah, to come through unscathed in all of that is pretty remarkable.
Well, I remember also when they had us sitting around this conference table discussing with all of us this series that they wanted to do. And although I don't think anybody really said anything about it after about a half an hour of this overview, but I think that virtually all of us, and I think there were 10 of us sitting around this table, and every single one of us thought everybody else was fucking nuts. Okay. You know, everything from whether you went into some crazy ass cave system or you fell out of a plane or you got attacked by, I don't care what it was. As far as I was concerned, I'm looking around this table going, all of these people are crazy, you know, and of course they'd look at somebody like me and go, that guy's crazy, you know, or, you know, it was.
I was going to say.
Well, another thing that was kind of interesting was one time the Explorers Club hosted a dinner with a bunch of us that were going to do presentations for the Explorers Club one evening. A bunch of, I don't know how many people they had come into this thing, but they had a dinner beforehand, and they had invited a bunch of members of the Explorers Club that had basically set, you know, they set certain records, I guess is the best way to put it. But everybody from Edmund Hillary, who climbed Everest, to Thor Heyerdahl, who crossed the Atlantic in Kon-Tiki, to all these people that, I mean, like Armstrong, who landed on the moon with Buzz Aldrin. And all these guys were at this dinner thing that we were doing. And I was there because I was the world's deepest scuba diver. And Chuck Yeager was the first guy to break the sound barrier. And again, it's kind of, we were sitting around this table enjoying a lot of scotch, okay, because we had to go out and talk to this group. But the interesting thing was here's all these members of the Explorers Club in this very elite group of people that set all these milestone records. And I just remember again looking around the table and thinking to myself, every single one of these people is fucking nuts, you know? And as we talk and raise a couple of drinks around, you know, and I think the first guy that actually said it was Scott Carpenter. Scott was one of the Mercury, you know, astronauts, and then later in Sea Lab. And I think as we were kind of looking around the table at our entire group of people, that's when Scott Carpenter finally said, "You're all friggin' crazy, and you should never even be allowed to drive cars."
Been an absolute pleasure speaking to you, Bret. It's been a while coming, hasn't it? We've been trying for a while.
Well, you guys did great about figuring out how to get this to work, because that's not, again, you know, I apologize because when I just if I just usually click on a link, boom, it takes me right there. And I do these interviews, you know, internationally, but the problems that we went through the other day for you poor guys, I felt sorry for you about that.
No, it's cool. We really appreciate your time, and I'm going to go away from this with one underlying image in my head of you and two dive buddies at 500 odd foot, kneeling on the seabed, waiting, and then up here it comes, the nuclear sub, and filming it as she passes. It's an image I'm never ever going to forget.
Yeah, well, think about this for a minute. At crawl speed, or ultimate slow speed, where they're completely almost soundproof, you know, those subs are moving around at 2 to 3 knots underwater. But when they leap ahead to reposition themselves and hide from the ballistic submarines, part of this is classified, but the top speed of one of these submarines is in excess of 70 knots. And we were filming these submarines from a distance of approximately 25 feet away in a triangle. There was 3 of us divers, diver to port, diver to starboard, diver on the top of the pyramid. And they would go by us so fast that we couldn't even see them. We just clicked the camera on and then do this, you know, this pan as it went by. And what we were trying to capture was the wake vortex, which allowed us to evaluate what influences and sound making characteristics might be evident. But it was absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed the experience, and I'm glad that I got out the other side, you know.
What a job.
Fantastic. Well, we could talk for hours, and we could do a whole episode just on the Navy stories that I'm sure, although some might be classified, that you could tell. But I think we've sort of exhausted you for the day. I really appreciate you coming on and having a chat with us. I'm sure our viewers on YouTube will find this absolutely fascinating, and we really do appreciate it, Bret.
Well, it's a pleasure being invited. It's nice to meet you both, and you know, I look forward to ultimately seeing this version of it. You know, send me a link or something like that.
Absolutely, we will.
I hope that maybe sometime when we get back to some level of normalcy again, maybe we could catch up. Where are you guys in the UK?
In Norfolk, so it's
where's Norfolk?
It sticks out
a bit south.
Yeah, it's just north of London, sort of northeast.
Well, you guys are close enough that, you know, maybe sometime we can get together, have dinner, have lunch, something.
Yeah,
like
absolutely. We'll come over and hook up with you and come out and see some whales.
Yeah.
That'd be good.
We'd enjoy that.
Now, you guys are also, I can see some of the images that I gave you that are behind you. And if you want to use any of those in some of your stuff, you're welcome to as well. Okay.
Yeah, fantastic.
But it's been a pleasure talking, and I'll see you guys later, I guess.
Really do appreciate it. Thank you very much, Bret.
Yes, and just one final thing. If you want to find out more, let me do it right. Check out www.bretgilliam.com.